If I told you that doctors are, currently figuring out how to reverse the structural effects of menopause, you'd probably assume we're talking about prescribing daily hormones.
Right, or some kind of intense surgical procedure.
Exactly. But what if I said they aren't doing either of those things? What if they're doing it by injecting microscopic text messages sent by stem cells?
I mean, it sounds completely absurd.
It sounds like science fiction, but this is literally happening in clinics right now.
It is. And, it sounds unbelievable because we're so conditioned to think of aging as this mechanical wear and tear, like a machine breaking down over time.
Yeah, like parts just wearing out.
Exactly. But modern biology is showing us something far more profound. Tissue aging isn't necessarily a broken machine. It's actually a communication failure.
So the cells are still there?
Yes, they're still there. They just aren't receiving the instructions to maintain the tissue anymore.
Okay, let's unpack this, because that brings us to our mission for today's deep dive. We are taking you to the absolute cutting-edge frontier of regenerative medicine to figure out exactly how these microscopic messengers, which are called intimate exosomes, actually stimulate collagen and elastin.
And this is a massive topic.
It really is. So to do this, we've pulled together a huge stack of sources for you. We're looking at peer-reviewed analyses from the journal MDPI, deep dives from the Anatolian Journal of Obstetrics and Gynecology Research, and real-world clinical protocols.
Plus some very real and often quite messy regulatory warnings from industry watchdogs.
Right, which is so important to balance the science with, because the aesthetic market loves a miracle cure.
Oh, they yell very loudly about them. But what's fascinating here is when you strip away all that marketing noise, the actual intercellular biology, I mean, the literal language your cells use to speak to one another, is fascinating enough on its own. It really doesn't need any exaggeration.
It totally doesn't. So to really grasp how a tiny microscopic message can rebuild tissue, we first need to look at why the tissue collapses in the first place.
Right, we have to start with the problem.
Exactly. Which is broadly categorized as the genitorinary syndrome of menopause, or GSM. So what is actually happening down there at a biological level when a woman's estrogen drops?
Well, when we talk about estrogen, we usually think of it systemically. But the pelvic region, so the vagina, the urethra, the bladder trigone, the pelvic floor, it is absolutely packed with estrogen receptor.
Like incredibly dense with them.
Highly dense. And they depend on that hormone for constant signaling. So when a woman enters perimenopause or menopause, and that systemic estrogen supply just plummets, the impact on the local tissue is dramatic.
And the sources mentioned the first thing that happens is this massive thinning of the mucosa.
Right, it just thins right out.
Because in a healthy premenopausal state, those superficial epithelial cells are constantly shedding. And as they shed, they release glycogen, which is essentially, food for healthy bacteria, specifically lactobacilli.
Exactly. But when estrogen drops, the number of those superficial cells drops to less than 10%.
Wow, less than 10%. That's a huge drop.
It is a massive drop. And that creates this devastating domino effect. Because with less glycogen, the healthy bacteria basically starve.
And when the lactobacilli die off, they stop producing lactic acid, right?
You got it. And that causes the vaginal pH to rise significantly. It creates this alkaline environment that is highly prone to chronic infections, irritation, all of that.
But the real structural collapse, like the loss of elasticity, that happens slightly deeper, right? Down in the connective tissue.
Yeah, down in the lamina propria. And this is where we run into the main character of our discussion today.
The fibroblast.
The fibroblast. It is the cellular workhorse of your connective tissue. Its entire job, its only purpose, is to manufacture collagen, which gives tissue strength, and elastin, which gives it that stretch and recoil.
But those fibroblasts are basically addicted to estrogen.
They are highly dependent on it to stay active, yeah. So without that hormonal signal telling them to keep working, they essentially go into hibernation. They turn into these dormant cells, which we call fibrocytes.
To put a visual on this for you listening, imagine a massive symphony orchestra. The fibroblasts are the musicians. They know how to play the instruments. They're sitting right there on the stage.
Right. They haven't left the building.
Exactly. But the conductor, which is estrogen, has just walked off the podium and left the building. So without the conductor keeping the tempo, the musicians just put their instruments down.
That is a brilliant way to conceptualize it. And because the musicians have stopped playing, the existing music, the collagen framework that holds everything together, it begins to distort.
It degrades.
It does. The existing collagen fibers in the dermal layer literally begin to fuse together. They become hyalinized.
Meaning they get kind of glassy and rigid.
Exactly. Completely non-functional structure.
Mm.
And simultaneously, the elastin fibers physically fragment. They just snap.
Which leads to a really difficult reality for millions of women. I mean, we're talking about severe vaginal dryness, a total loss of elasticity, tearing, bleeding, intense pain during intercourse.
The physical scaffolding of the tissue is just gone.
And for decades, if you went to a doctor for this, you were basically told, well, that's just a normal part of getting older.
Right, just deal with it.
Yeah. Or you might be offered like a synthetic lubricant to mask the friction, or localized hormone replacement therapy, like a topical estrogen cream.
Which is great for some, but localized hormones aren't an option for everyone, particularly for women who are survivors of hormone receptor-positive breast cancers.
Because for them, adding estrogen back into the system, even locally, carries a massive risk.
A huge risk. So the challenge for regenerative medicine became, how do we get the musicians to start playing again without bringing the original conductor back into the room?
And traditional stem cell therapy tried to solve this by basically surgically dropping a bunch of brand new, younger musicians onto the stage.
Right, just inject live cells. But that comes with its own massive risks.
Because injecting live cells means they could replicate uncontrollably.
Uncontrollably, yeah. Or your body could mount a massive immune attack against them because it recognizes them as foreign.
So it's super unpredictable.
Incredibly unpredictable. We knew stem cells had the power to heal tissue, but the vehicle, the live cell itself, was the problem. And this is where exosomes changed everything.
Because researchers figured out that stem cells don't heal tissue by turning into new tissue themselves.
Exactly. They heal tissue by secreting tiny nano-sized bubbles filled with genetic instructions. Those bubbles are the exosomes.
So we aren't using the stem cells themselves anymore. We're literally just harvesting the text messages they send out.
Yes. Exosomes are completely cell-free. They're just extracellular vesicles. And they are incredibly small.
Like, how small are we talking?
We're talking measuring between 30 to 150 nanometers in diameter. To put that in perspective, they are roughly 1,000th the size of a single human hair.
That is so small, it's hard to even picture.
And they are surrounded by this double-layered lipid membrane, which basically acts as a protective armor.
Like a microscopic envelope that keeps the message safe from, degrading in the bloodstream or the tissue fluid.
Exactly the function of that lipid layer. And inside that envelope is a highly specific payload gathered from the parent cell.
Which is usually a mesenchymal stem cell, right? From human fat or umbilical cord tissue.
Right. And this payload consists of messenger RNA, microRNA, highly specific proteins, growth factors, and lipids.
Okay, so an aesthetic clinic takes a vial of these isolated, purified envelopes, billions of them, and either injects them or applies them topically to the intimate tissue, usually after microneedling to help them get in.
Right, to create those microchannels.
But here is the core question. This is the main focus of our entire deep dive today. Once these envelopes arrive at the locked doors of the dormant fibroblast, what exactly do the instructions say?
That's a great question.
Like, how does a literal envelope of RNA force a sleeping cell to start churning out collagen again?
The mechanism is just incredibly elegant. So when the exosome bumps into the dormant fibroblast, its lipid membrane fuses with the cell membrane of the fibroblast.
It just melts into it.
Basically, yeah. It opens the envelope and dumps its payload of microRNA and proteins directly into the cytoplasm of the sleeping cell. And the primary goal of this payload is to activate a specific communication channel known as the TGF-beta signaling pathway.
Okay, let's translate that pathway because the sources get very dense here.
Yeah.
They start talking about inducing the phosphorylation of intracellular SMAD complexes.
Yeah, that's a mouthful. Let's break that down. When the payload enters the cell, it needs a way to carry its message all the way into the inner fold.
The nucleus, where the DNA is.
Exactly. It does this by finding specific proteins in the cell, which we call SMAD complexes. You can think of these SMAD proteins as middle managers.
Okay, middle managers. I like
so
that.
The exosome payload tags these middle managers with a burst of chemical energy. That is the phosphorylation process.
It basically hypes them up.
Right. And once they have that energy tag, the middle managers physically travel straight into the nucleus.
They just march right into the boss's office and hand over the new sheet music.
They do. Once inside the nucleus, they bind directly to the DNA and begin regulating gene transcription. They literally start flipping the genetic switches that the lack of estrogen had turned off.
Oh, wow.
And they do 3 very specific things simultaneously to rebuild the tissue.
Which is a really delicate balancing act based on the research. Because you can't just tell a cell to blindly start making collagen.
No, you have to deal with the existing damage first.
Right, the cleanup.
That is the crucial first step. Because in aging, estrogen-deficient tissue, there are enzymes constantly at work breaking things down. They're called matrix metalloproteinases, or MMPs.
MMPs.
Imagine them as a demolition crew inside the concert hall. Without estrogen to keep them in check, they're just tearing up the floorboards and smashing the chairs.
Just wrecking the place. So the first thing the exosome instructions do is stop the demolition.
Exactly. They deliver a genetic command that upregulates a protein called TIMP, that stands for tissue inhibitors of metalloproteinases.
So the TIMP floods the area and completely neutralizes the MMP demolition crew.
Yes, and at the exact same time, the exosomes deliver microRNA that downregulates the production of TNF-alpha, which is one of the body's primary inflammatory cytokines.
So we fire the demolition crew and we stop the localized inflammation that's been making the tissue angry and swollen.
Exactly. And only once the environment is stabilized do the exosomes flip the final switch, upregulating that TGF-beta pathway to command the fibroblasts to start producing fresh material.
And what is truly remarkable is the type of material they produce. They trigger this massive increase in healthy collagen type I and elastin.
And crucially, they actively decrease the production of collagen type 3.
Yes, the sources emphasize that.
Yeah.
Why is that distinction between type I and type 3 so important for you listening to understand?
Because not all collagen is created equal. Collagen type I is the long, supple, elastic protein that gives youthful tissue its incredible resilience.
Right, the good stuff.
The good stuff. Collagen type 3, on the other hand, is the body's panic response. It's the rigid, fibrotic protein that makes up scar tissue.
Oh, yikes.
Yeah. By suppressing type 3 and boosting type I, the exosomes ensure that the new tissue being built isn't tough or fibrotic. It's functional, supple, and healthy.
Wait, I need to stop you there and push back on this a little bit because this sounds almost too perfect.
I know it does.
If these are just messages in an envelope, why wouldn't an older, dormant cell, like a cell that has been subjected to decades of biological aging and oxidative stress, just ignore the message?
It's a profound question.
Right. Like, how does a burst of RNA actually override the physical reality of a 60-year-old tissue environment?
Well, it strikes at the heart of why regenerative medicine is so disruptive. The cell doesn't ignore the message because the exosome's payload operates at the epigenetic level.
Meaning it's bypassing the environment entirely.
Exactly. It isn't asking the cell nicely. It is delivering regulatory microRNA that physically binds to the cell's messenger RNA, silencing the pathways that cause senescence and forcibly turning on the pathways for youth.
So it's a hard override.
Yes. The cell hasn't forgotten how to be young. Its DNA is the exact same DNA it had when you were 20. It was simply adapting to an environment devoid of estrogen. The exosome provides a localized, overwhelming signal that overrides that environmental cue.
So we're literally tricking the local cells into believing the environment is perfectly optimal again. We handed out the new sheet music, and the musicians just started playing flawlessly. But if we stick with that symphony metaphor for a second, having a great orchestra doesn't mean much if the concert hall itself has no power and the roof is caving in.
Very true.
Rebuilding the collagen and elastin only restores the structural scaffolding. For the intimate tissue to truly thrive, to regain sensation and lubrication, it needs a blood supply.
It needs massive logistical support. And this is where the holistic nature of exosome therapy outshines traditional treatments like synthetic fillers.
Because fillers just take up space.
Right, they just sit there. Exosomes orchestrate a complete tissue revival, and a vital part of this is a process called angiogenesis.
The creation of new blood vessels.
The plumbing.
The plumbing, yes. The exosomes carry another vital instruction set centered around a protein called VEGF, vascular endothelial growth factor.
And what does VEGF do?
When the exosomes interact with the endothelial cells that line your blood vessels, they transfer this VEGF payload. This acts as a catalyst, triggering the growth of dense, brand new capillary networks throughout the vaginal and vulvar tissue, which means a massive increase in the delivery of oxygen and nutrients.
And a restoration of natural lubrication, which, is essentially just healthy blood plasma transuding through the vaginal walls.
Wow. But the exosomes also bring their own security detail, right, to protect all this newly built infrastructure.
They absolutely do. The sources note a heavy presence of antioxidant molecules transferred within the exosome payload, specifically enzymes like superoxide dismutase, or SOD, and glutathione peroxidase, or GPX.
Okay, so what do SOD and GPX actually do in the tissue?
They act as a shield against oxidative stress. As our cells metabolize oxygen, they create free radicals.
Which are bad news.
Very bad news. They're unstable molecules that rip through tissue and accelerate aging. SOD and GPX neutralize those free radicals before they can cause damage.
So you aren't just building new collagen and new blood vessels, you are simultaneously protecting them from degrading again.
Exactly. It's a complete defense system.
Let's ground all of this cellular biology into the physical reality for the listener, because we aren't just talking about, like, aesthetic tweaks here. Clinics are utilizing this deep tissue repair for some incredibly debilitating conditions.
The clinical applications are expanding rapidly, yeah. We see it being used for postpartum women who are experiencing severe tissue laxity or scarring from episiotomies or a loss of sensation after childbirth.
Because the angiogenesis drastically improves nerve health and tissue density.
Exactly.
It's also showing major promise for stress urinary incontinence.
Oh, huge promise.
Because if you can thicken and strengthen the supportive connective tissues and the pelvic floor muscles surrounding the urethra, you can provide the mechanical support needed to stop involuntary leaking.
Which is life-changing for so many women.
Truly. But the application that really stood out to me in the clinical protocols was for a condition called lichen sclerosus.
Yes, lichen sclerosus is an incredibly difficult, chronic, inflammatory autoimmune condition of the vulva.
It's awful.
It causes relentless itching, severe thinning of the skin, and these painful white plaques that eventually lead to heavy scarring and even anatomical changes.
And for years, the absolute gold standard of treatment has just been ultra-potent topical corticosteroids.
Right. But using a heavy steroid on intimate tissue for years at a time has its own massive drawbacks, doesn't it?
I mean, steroids inherently thin the skin over time, which feels completely counterproductive when the tissue is already fragile.
That is the cruel irony of traditional treatments. You use the steroid to stop the catastrophic inflammation, but the long-term side effect is tissue atrophy.
But exosome therapy is offering a paradigm shift for these patients.
It really is, because exosomes deliver such a potent, localized anti-inflammatory signal, down-regulating things like TNF-alpha, they can halt the autoimmune flare-up.
But instead of thinning the tissue like a steroid, they simultaneously rebuild the collagen matrix.
Right, they repair the damage without the side effects of chronic steroid use.
Okay, so we've walked through the biology, we see the clinical potential. If sending these cellular text messages works so brilliantly to restore intimate tissue, why isn't every single gynecologist offering this tomorrow?
That is the million-dollar question.
Why isn't this the first line of defense for every menopausal woman?
Well, because the science is moving at light speed, and the regulatory bodies are moving at a glacial pace. The exosome industry right now is, frankly, a Wild West.
Here's where it gets really interesting, because the source material is very clear about the friction happening in the market. The price discrepancy alone is staggering.
Oh, it's all over the place.
You can go online and find clinics offering exon treatments for a few $100s and others down the street charging upwards of $5,000 for a single session.
And as a patient, that is a terrifying landscape to navigate. Because that price difference isn't just clinic markup.
No, it's not just a fancy waiting room.
It comes down to where the exosomes were sourced, how densely concentrated they are, and crucially, the purification methods used by the laboratory.
Because you aren't just scooping exosomes out of a petri dish. You have to separate the tiny envelopes from all the cellular garbage.
The purification process is incredibly difficult and expensive. Premium laboratories use advanced ultracentrifugation and filtration to isolate pure, intact vesicles.
And the cheaper ones?
Cheaper products might skip those rigorous steps, leaving you with a vial full of dead cellular debris, broken proteins, and very few actual active exosomes.
And there is no governing body currently checking those vials before they get to the clinic. Let's talk about the FDA. Because as of right now, there are absolutely zero FDA-approved exosome products for aesthetic or cosmetic medical applications in the United States.
Zero. That is a fundamental fact every listener needs to understand.
Right.
While the preclinical data, the cellular biology, and the observational case series from doctors show tremendous promise, regulatory agencies require massive, multi-year, double-blind, randomized controlled trials to prove long-term safety.
And those trials simply haven't been completed yet.
Exactly. There's no standardized dosing.
But the regulatory landscape gets even wilder when you look globally. I was reading through the source warnings regarding the UK market, and I had to read it twice to make sure I understood it.
The UK situation is fascinating.
Because human-derived exosomes, the ones harvested from umbilical cords or adipose tissue that we've been talking about, the ones driving all the incredible clinical data, They are strictly illegal for cosmetic or aesthetic use in the UK.
They are. They fall under a very strict classification in the UK and the European Union known as Advanced Therapy Medicinal Products, or ATMPs.
Because they come from humans.
Exactly. Because they are derived from human donors, the regulators treat them with the utmost caution regarding safety, rigorous donor screening, and, the theoretical risk of communicable disease transmission.
So the barrier to entry for a cosmetic clinic to use a human ATMP is practically insurmountable.
It is.
So women in the UK just don't have access to this regenerative science.
Well, the aesthetic industry is incredibly adaptable. To comply with the strict laws banning human-derived products, many major distributors and clinics in the UK completely pivoted. They abandoned human stem cells and moved to plant-derived exosomes.
Wait, pause. So because of a regulatory loophole, women in the UK are having their intimate tissues rejuvenated using the cellular instructions of a plant.
Yes.
The sources mention a major Korean biotech distributor, EvoCyte, that switched to rose exosomes. Does the cellular machinery of a rose bush actually work inside a human vagina?
I know, it sounds crazy,
Yeah.
but it's a completely mind-bending concept known as cross-kingdom communication.
Cross-kingdom.
Plants produce extracellular vesicles, just like humans do. And remarkably, the lipid membranes of plant exosomes are structurally very similar to ours. So when a rose exosome is introduced to human skin or mucosal tissue, human cells can actually absorb it.
But the sheet music is different. A rose doesn't have a TGF-beta pathway, does it?
Well, it doesn't have the exact same human proteins, no. But the plant vesicles carry powerful anti-inflammatory molecules, potent antioxidants, and plant microRNAs that have been shown to positively influence human cellular pathways.
So they still do something useful.
Oh, absolutely. They can suppress inflammation and stimulate hydration. So yes, they exert a measurable beneficial effect on human tissue, and they completely bypass the human donor regulatory bans.
That is absolutely wild, but it also proves how unstandardized this frontier is. Because if you are a patient seeking this therapy, the biological product injected into your tissue could be human umbilical signals, or it could be the instructions from a flower, entirely depending on which country's soil you are standing on.
This raises an important question, right? Which is why the burden of knowledge currently falls heavily on the patient. You cannot simply book an appointment for quote-unquote exosomes.
No, you have to do your homework.
You have to ask your provider the hard questions. What specific product are you using? Is it human or plant-derived? What laboratory isolated it? And what purification standards do they hold themselves to?
Okay, so taking a step back and looking at this massive stack of research, so what does this all mean for you listening? We are undeniably witnessing a fundamental shift in how medicine approaches aging and tissue repair.
A total paradigm shift.
We are moving away from the era of mechanics. We aren't just surgically stretching tissue tight. We aren't just pumping in synthetic hyaluronic acid to mask a structural collapse. And we aren't solely relying on flooding the entire body with systemic hormones.
We are entering an era of targeted information. By utilizing exosomes, we are leveraging billions of years of evolutionary research and development.
We're using the body's own language.
Exactly. We are taking the exact intercellular language of healing and aiming it precisely at the specific tissues that need a reminder of how to function.
It is the ultimate biological life hack, even if the government regulations and clinical standardizations are, still struggling to catch up to the sheer speed of the science.
They'll get there, but it takes time.
But walking away from these sources, it leaves us with a truly profound thought to consider. If we can now isolate the exact biological messages that trigger healing, like if we can capture the molecular instructions for youth, put them in a microscopic envelope, and deliver them directly to a dormant cell without the risks of injecting live tissue, are we approaching a future where tissue aging isn't an inevitable mechanical decline?
That's a huge question.
Is aging at its core just a simple communication error? And if so, are we finally learning how to debug the system?
It really forces us to completely rethink the boundary between what is permanently lost and what simply needs the right set of instructions to be found again.
The symphony of your cells might be playing out of tune today, but maybe, just maybe, we've finally figured out how to print new sheet music. Thanks for diving deep with us. Keep questioning, keep learning, and we'll catch you on the next one.